developers and gamers come around to understanding each other and why this is good for both.
Interesting. Let's get back to Alice a little. I kind of jumped the train.
It's
uh,
okay.
in the Through the Looking Glass book by Lewis Carroll, I have to say, which always disturbed me and has given me kind of a fear of mirrors in certain poems, there's a much darker kind of look to the Alice game than people think of when they think of like the Disney Alice character. Do you consider it a horror game, and what was the reception for that?
I don't think that they're horror games. I think that she's been through some horrific events. And like I said before, the things that we're seeing and we're experiencing, they are always a function of Alice's psyche. We even had one rule during production that she could not see or experience something in Wonderland unless there was a valid, identifiable inspiration that she could have taken out of the environment in which she lived. So that means that if we were going to see a steam train, she would have had to have exposure to steam trains at some point in her life. If we were going to see a rocket ship, that wasn't going to work because she never would have seen or heard
Period.
of.
I see.
Exactly.
I see.
Uh, so what we're looking at is, the landscape of Alice's mind as has been defined by her experiences in her life up until the point where we're joining her in this adventure. So yeah, some really terrible things have happened to her, but the point of this is not horror. The point of this is not to frighten the player or to have that sort of visceral experience that's all about blood and guts. And this was one of the things that we did have some disagreement with EA over, that they wanted it to be categorized as a horror game. They wanted it to be in the same genre type as Dead Space or Dante's Inferno because they know how to sell that. They know where that fits on the shelf space. And so that was something that we had to wrestle over quite a bit because I've never seen the games as horror like that.
I've heard that the rights were sold as a possible movie. Do you think we'll ever see like Alice in film?
It, it's hard to say. The rights are still out there. There's a guy in Hollywood, the producer, who is still sitting on top of them, and I think trying to get something done. But I don't really keep contact with him.
Okay. I believe at this point you left to form the and I'm going to say it wrong, Mauritania Import Export Company, uh, your own game studio. Why that name, and what happened to that after Scrapeland and Bad Day LA?
So TMIEC was the very unwieldy abbreviation for that company. It took its name from a building that I was living in at the time called the Mauritania Building, which was in Los Angeles. That was a historic building that was, oddly enough, created by one of the stars from the original Wizard of Oz movie. And so I'd had this idea to do a Wizard of Oz game, but it just so happened that when I moved to Los Angeles, the second place that I ended up living in Los Angeles was this building that had been created by one of the Wizard of Oz stars. So
I
yeah, that company existed for a number of years. It was meant to be an independent game production, kind of studio. Not that we were developing titles, but that we were acting as producers and designers for them. And so we managed to get the Oz project started up, but that project was killed by Atari when they ran into financial trouble. We also managed to do things like Scrapland, which was my helping with an existing development team and their existing game to finalize it and then also to go out and market it and sell it. And then that also led to my moving to Hong Kong to work on Bad Day LA, which I think, as everybody knows, was a pretty bad game.
have not played it, I can't say. I'm curious about the American McGee's Oz, which I believe never got produced, and I understand there were some sort of financial difficulties with Atari. Uh, do you feel like there's elements of that are going to come out in something new? Um, kind of kind of heard rumors that maybe there was some sort of collaboration or beginnings talks for the Oz the is it Oz the Great movie that's come out. There's been rumor that maybe there was something that had to do with that movie, that you may have written a script that I don't know if ended up being part of it or not. What's the truth about that?
Yeah, so we did get a project going with Atari around the Wizard of Oz idea that I came up with. That also led to, like, I think a book deal and a toy deal and then a film deal. And for the film deal, that was signed up with Bruckheimer, who had been looking for an Oz project for some number of years and happened to like the pitch that we gave for this idea. They hired writers, and then after some year or more, they decided that those writers weren't really getting the job done. So they asked me to write. I spent a year working with them on a script, which I turned in, and then never heard from them again, which I'm pretty sure means they thought it was terrible. I think that's the Hollywood way of like, this was really bad. Don't call us. We'll call you. So that all kind of took place after the game version had already been killed by Atari, and by that point, also I had moved to Hong Kong, and so had kind of started to leave behind the U.S. and a lot of the what I felt like were old projects. So these days, the Oz project is really encumbered. I mean, the film rights still reside with Disney and Bruckheimer. The game rights are still tied up to some degree with Atari, and everything else that goes with it's sort of still tied up in the old company, the Mauritania company, which is now defunct, but there are still ex-partners out there who may want to lay claim to various pieces of IP. All that basically says is it's not really worth my time to try to explore it. If we did go after Oz again, it would be a completely fresh reimagining and wouldn't have anything to do with the old version. But I'm not in a big hurry to try to explore that right now. We have a lot of ideas floating around the studio for different types of games, and they're not all Twisted Fairy Tales. And in fact, I want to give the people in our studio a chance to kind of spread their wings and express their ideas and to work on things that they're interested in that are not always going to be in the dark, fairy tale genre.
Hmm. I've always wondered what happens when a studio closes, like 38 studios closed this year. I knew they were working on Ascendant and God the Game. And I always wonder what happens to all that material and all those ideas, especially if you're, halfway through development and a studio closes.
Someone ends up owning it. Nothing just opens up and becomes publicly available. When there's an asset that's owned by a company and the company declares bankruptcy, like what happened recently with THQ, they owe creditors money, and so then they have an auction, and people go in and start bidding for various pieces of IP, or maybe even down to something as mundane as a chair or a printer that was sitting in their building. But everything has a real world value, and nothing can be disowned when it comes to companies. Everything eventually has to be assigned to a new owner, liquidated, sold off, whatever. And so that would be the same thing that happened, for instance, with the Mauritania company. We went through the IP and picked out stuff that I was interested in, which I held on to, and then let other stuff go to various, other forms or states.
Okay. Is there any rivalry between you and Atari because of that financial difficulties? Do you feel like satisfaction now that they've
That's
filed for
been,
Chapter 11?
that's been such a long time. They've gone through bankruptcy so many times over the last 15 years that it's not really possible to point a finger at any one person or group of people who defines what Atari is for more than a few years, because every couple of years that brand name gets bought, sold, bankrupted, bought, sold, and new teams of people form around it and the IP that it owns. So I don't have any hard feelings about that at all.
Take me to the founding of Spicy Horse, and it kind of the assumption is that from your previous company, which I'll have to look up the name again, that most of that kind of just ended up becoming Spicy Horse. How did the founding of that? What's the story of that?
Well, I was living in Hong Kong. I'd left U.S. and I think that was around 2005, and was working on Bad Day LA, which was for a developer publisher based in Hong Kong called Inlight. And so they had given us a very small development budget and asked us to build what was very much an overly ambitious project with that and a pretty small team. And then after that was finished up, I was offered a development contract from GameTap in the US, who are owned by Time Warner. And so they came in and said, look, we'd like you to make another Twisted Fairy Tale game with your branding on it. And I told them that I didn't have a studio or capability to respond to this. And they said, not a problem. Go build a studio wherever you'd like. And at that point, I had been traveling to Shanghai to help a friend of mine open an outsourced studio to do 3D art assets. And so I had experience and exposure to Shanghai, and I'd already had the idea that the landscape here was such that there were really only two places that you could work if you were a game developer. There were the large Chinese operators, which are the biggest game companies in the world, which of course most Western gamers have never heard of. Companies like Tencent, Shanda, The Nine, NetEase. Or you could go work for an outsourcer producing 3D art content, which ironically goes back to the US and is played by US gamers, and they don't realize that.
Ah,
So when you're playing Call of Duty or Medal of Honor or any game practically on console these days, the art assets are being made in China and then put together by teams in the US or in the UK or whatever. And so my thought was, wow, this is not a great place if you want to make independent games, that you want to do independent games for the Western market. So the thought was, why not open a studio in Shanghai, work on original ideas, and give developers in China an opportunity to work somewhere that's not either directed at the local market or outsourcing for the Western market.
where did the name come from? It sounds like forbiddenly delicious.
So in this is a bit egotistical, but the name Spicy Horse in Chinese, my name is Lucky Horse. If you take my last name McGee, then you turn that into Chinese, it's McGee. And I'm a big fan of spicy food, so mala is how you would say the kind of very specific spicy numb flavor that a lot of Chinese food has is called mala. So in Chinese, the company is called Ma La Ma, the spicy horse. To Chinese ear, it sounds quite nice. It's really kind of rhythmic. And also things like the domain name was available. We could make a cool logo out of it. So there were a lot of
Yes.
things that drove us towards the decision. And yeah, I think it ended up being pretty unique and it works pretty well here in China as well.
What's the atmosphere there? Is it a large studio?
We have 50 people working here now, so that's two buildings. The one I sit in is almost entirely our art department, so animators, 2D artists, 3D artists. And then we have a second building that is our tech, producers, level designers, game designers. The buildings we are in are 100 plus years old, so they've been here on Suzhou Creek, which runs through the middle of Shanghai, for a long time, and they've been everything from originally a flour mill to warehouses to apparently smugglers and thieves once used the buildings as well. So there's a lot of history inside the buildings.
Possibilities of secret places.
Not so much because they're kind of like warehouses. I mean, they're very cool, but they're very big, open spaces. So there's not a lot of hidey holes or secret places.
I have to ask because I've been told to do so. Do you get any flack for being named America in China?
No, not so much. So the Chinese kind of normal thing that you would do at some point in high school, or maybe younger, is to choose an English name. And so the names that get picked are sometimes really funny. They don't have the same kind of prohibition or ideas about names that we do of what's normal or what's appropriate or not. So I've had the honor here in China of working with Led Zeppelin. Another guy named himself Catastrophe. There was one guy whose nickname was Speed Shit. We had a girl whose name was Bosom. We had a guy whose name was Danielle. There have been so many unusual names. So when I introduce myself and I say my name is American, they're like, whatever. You're not anywhere near as weird as like the guy who named himself Alien, as an example. So no, it's actually a country that's great for having an unusual name.
Neat. So the fascination with fairy tales, and you've called them twisted fairy tales before, the Brothers Grimm, Wizard of Oz, Alice, all of that. What is the draw for that? And did you used to read these books as a child?
I did read the books as a child, and I think that the draw then, much as it is today, I'm always very interested in the psychology that goes into the formation of the tales and the fact that they go back so far into what makes us human. They go back like a Red Riding Hood, for instance, there's no written record of the origin of that story.